Welcome to the Skeptic's Guide to Investing with Steve Davenport and Clem Miller. Every 2 weeks, Steve and Clem bring you brief investment insights you may not find anywhere else. We hope you enjoy today's episode. Here are Steve and Clem.
Welcome, everyone. And today we're going to talk to you about, this is Steve Davenport and Clem Miller, and we're here from Skeptic's Guide to Investing. And today we're going to talk about a topic that has been in the news a lot and is generating a lot of buzz, but we're not sure if this buzz is just more and more puffery. So we thought we would try to dig into the concept of a sovereign wealth fund for the US. And this concept is around for countries like Saudi Arabia, which have a lot of money coming from energy, and they realize that that's a limited supply. So ultimately, they're trying to create other industries with their sovereign wealth fund to allow the country to move from an energy-based economy to a broad-based economy. The US is already a broad-based economy. So Clem, where does a sovereign wealth fund sit in your probabilities and also in how it would be funded?
So I don't think that we are going to end up with something that's called a sovereign wealth fund in the sense that you were talking about with Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or the UAE, which have large investments in, at least in part, in domestic industries, that serve as sort of development funds, or the type of sovereign wealth fund that Alaska has, the permanent fund, or that Norway has. Which are basically funds that invest in, a combination of fixed income and equities and alternatives. Sort of what you would think of as an endowment, right? So there's a difference. There are two different types of sovereign wealth funds. One are sort of the normal endowment type wealth funds, and the other one are basically development funds. And I really don't see the U.S. government being involved in either of those. And I think that the main reason for that has to do with the question of, how would the U.S. government actually fund those sovereign wealth funds or the sovereign wealth fund? How would they fund it? Where would they get the capital for this from? And so that's the key question. Steve, I think, there have been precious few options sort of presented for this. It's almost like, the idea is that, well, we'll conjure this funding out from nowhere, right? And so we're
going to conjure it from all the savings that the government gets from the Doge. But I've heard three different sources. It's going to come from the cost savings of the government. It's going to come from the existing gold reserves we have, and we're going to convert from gold to other investments. And then I've also heard that it's going to come from the tariffs. And I think that if we're going to fabricate money, we can fabricate it from many different places. The question is, are we taking it away from a current need and investing in a long-term, return that we think is going to be better than some of the current needs? And I think that I don't know what's the downside to us putting more money into the markets and allowing government to be a beneficiary of excessive Fed easing.
Well, let me just talk about some of the funding sources that you were talking about. So, if to the extent there are Doge efficiencies, those aren't going to be used to fund a sovereign wealth fund. Those are going to be used to try to reduce deficits. So, I just don't think, I don't think we're going to have the necessary support among the Tea Party conservatives within the Republican Party, those who are concerned about deficits, to use those Doge savings, to just use them, willy-nilly for a sovereign wealth fund or for anything else for that matter, any other ideas like, building condos in Gaza or whatnot. I just don't think that's going to happen.
But they do think that they will pass the tax bill, which will, also cause more deficit.
Yeah. I mean, they're going to reduce, they're going to, if they're going to use this money from the Doge savings for anything, it's basically to cover the additional deficit costs arising from the tax bill. It's not going to be used to fund a sovereign wealth fund. That's not going to happen. I think that there's another, you mentioned the gold funding, selling gold to fund this. I'd have to look at the numbers, but honestly, I don't think there's enough gold to really create a meaningful sovereign wealth fund, along the lines of what, a Norway has or an Alaska has or whatnot. Saudi or UAE.
I guess I would ask is how big would it have to be to really to be what I would call a normal size? I think that Norway, we know, is a huge part of their economy because they've done unbelievably well. And UAE and Saudi Arabia, I think, are large, but I don't know. Are we talking about 10% of the economy, 20% of the economy? Because then we can say the US is 30 trillion in economy, GDP, and come up with a rough estimate of how much
Right.
a sovereign wealth fund should be.
I think that's a good question. I think that if you look at, at some of these smaller economies, you're talking about sovereign wealth funds that are 500 billion or upwards of $1 trillion, right? They're big, these sovereign wealth funds. So if you apply that to a much larger economy like ours, the equivalent would have to be something like $2 or $3 trillion, right? And that's, nothing like that is ever going to happen. It's just not going to happen. The other thing I would mention is, how is this, where's the funding going to go from this sovereign wealth fund? And who's going to determine where it's going to go? Is it going to be allocated on a political basis? Is it going to be allocated by, professional investors without political oversight? I think, Steve, you and I would agree that there's going to be, if there is a sovereign wealth fund, there's going to be a lot of political interference in such a fund, in the operation of such a fund.
Oh, I think that we could just talk for the whole hour about how it gets funded, and we could cover every different, but I agree the problems don't just end with how does it get funded. The problems don't end with how do we pick between different investments of different areas of the US economy. But then I think the arm's lengthness and the discipline to have a really good sovereign wealth fund. Just for, giggles, Norway's sovereign wealth fund is 4 times the GDP of Norway. So, Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, is not, it can't be that large because that would be, but I don't know. It's an interesting, I think it's an interesting construct, but I think it's just that it stays on the drawing board because I think there are too many conflicts in our economy. My question is if this makes sense in that there are companies who are starving for capital who aren't getting it in the United States, and the government could be a viable lender or investor of last resort to help things that don't normally get proper investment. I could see this for woman-based
Okay.
startups. I could see this for low-income startups. I could see this for just like we have, investment in communities and opportunity zones. This would become the
Okay. So Steve,
opportunity zone from real estate to the opportunity zone for investors.
so Steve, everything you just mentioned is stuff that the US government already does
Okay.
and already has programs for, and is routinely thought of as being kind of by the Republicans as being far left ideas. These are, the idea of, opportunity zones are a Republican idea, or let's say a Republican idea that's been adopted also by the Democrats. But that's different. That's like providing tax cuts. What the Republicans are against is the idea of funds being outlaid for uh, you know what they would consider to be boondoggles. Okay, so that's why they were so against. That's why the Republicans are so against the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, because it had a lot of funds going out for things like solar and wind and the CHIPS Act, and on the in terms of providing subsidies for semiconductor development. I mean, this goes back a long way. I mean, I used to work for the Export-Import Bank for many years, and that was an entity that provided financing or guarantees for financing to support U.S. exporters for the purpose of creating jobs. And, so it goes back to that. And that entity was created in 1934. So, you've got a lot of government agencies. You got the Agriculture Department makes loans for uh, to support production, wheat production, corn production, to provide equipment, agricultural equipment. You've got the U.S.
Do
government is,
do those things necessarily not have funding though?
yeah, the
I
U.S.
guess that's what
Well,
I'm
they have
wondering
that.
is,
The U.S. government is very, very involved in funding various aspects of the U.S. economy. The U.S. government, it always operates or claims to operate as the lender of last resort, to use the term that you use. They use that all the time in justifying these programs. And I'm not saying the programs are bad. I think these programs are important. But I just want to make the point that you don't need a sovereign wealth fund on top of what the U.S. government is already doing in these programs, and that the Tea Party.
well, if it gives you a higher percent return, I mean, let's talk about returns to the community, whether they be abstract returns or whether they be actual dollars. Does that matter to you, Glenn?
What do you mean? Okay, I'm
I
not sure.
mean, if we have a Head Start program that we invest in for young children, and we say, okay, we're putting this money as an investment in our future.
Well,
And,
we already have a Head Start program. So
yeah, and
if we just if there was political and courts opposition, which there is now, to cutting some of these things, to the Doge operations, you're going to preserve these operations that have been built up over the decades. And you won't need to create this sort of sovereign wealth fund, which, would in effect be a slush fund, right?
right.
For
Uh,
for politicians and their friends, or, to use the expression that you hear a lot of, the billionaire class, right? Uh,
right. I just want to have the understanding that a lot of this idea of returns of a fund or returns to society or returns of existing programs to compare, how do we keep one program versus another? Well, because this one has a higher return on the investment. And my question to you is, are we really stacking things by investment return? Or are we just saying these things have investments and just like anybody else selling an investment, they believe the return is worthwhile, so you should invest. But are people just talking their own book, or are people really actually have returns that show you that road investment and infrastructure gives you a 9.4 return and Head Start gives you a 12.4, so you should always give to Head Start ahead of highways.
So,
Does this really exist in the world?
Steve, I think I think what you're talking about falls under the category of the streetlight effect. You know what that is? Streetlight effect is where, if you drop a quarter out of your pocket on a dark night, the first place you're going to look is under a streetlight. Okay, but that's a psychological thing, right? It's easier to see a financial return when it comes to a stock or a bond. Much easier to see it. But that doesn't mean that the returns on things like Head Start or on roads and bridges and so on aren't don't have economic returns. They do have economic returns. They're just not as easy to measure or define as the financial returns you get from a stock or a bond. Doesn't mean they're any less valuable. They could be even more valuable to the extent these economic returns, are earned over, decades.
Yeah, it's like Bitcoin. If you own it over a few decades, its return is tremendous, right?
Uh, no. Okay. Its return. Yeah. Its return ultimately will be zero. Okay. Because the whole thing will collapse, in my opinion. The whole issue about Bitcoin is all about when do you get in and when do you get out.
Right.
And and if you
I'm giving you a hard time, Clem, and I'm not. I know that you realize that, but I just think the discussion about returns and efficient use of capital and putting that in the same sentence with Doge, where we've got such a broad economy and so many people and so many ways that are interconnected that we're really, when we look at the world and how government makes decisions, we have this idealistic image that there's some efficient allocator of capital that moves between one part of government to another part of government. And those funds are all moving in such a way that they maximize the benefit to the US citizen. And in reality, they
right,
maximize the benefit to whoever the congressman and senator is in that state that's going to get that funding. And that's what they focus on. And that's all they care about because they're there for 2 years or 6 years, but they're still based on a short-term
right.
focus.
From the standpoint of the of Congress, right? There's no question about that. There's a political, either political inputs or a political layer, let's call it, of analytical review. Well, not even analytical review, a political layer of decision making
Right.
on top of that. It's sort of like, it's sort of like how the defense industry, Boeing and so on, they spread their operations across the country, trying to cover as many states and districts as possible to establish support for their various expensive programs. So the same kind of thing. You try to establish political support, and my issue with the sovereign wealth fund is that you're putting an awful lot of power in the hands of the 4 or 5 people who might constitute the board or the investment committee of the sovereign wealth fund. And
I agree. I think it's ludicrous to try to. I mean, first of all, let's just stop from one topic and go on to the next, which is how we would fund this when we are already so far in debt at 123% of GDP. And that doesn't include our obligations to Social Security and Medicare, which would add trillions more to the obligation of the US government. So while we're somewhere around 36, 37 billion, I think that the number is really closer to 55 billion of obligations and
trillion.
trillion. Sorry, I forgot the singular. 55 trillion on a 30
It's so
trillion,
big, it's hard to even imagine.
the 30 trillion economy is ridiculous. And I think that what we're seeing is how do we then decide that we're going to give somebody else in government the money to make decisions about where the future of the US economy should go? And in my mind, there's already plenty of programs and ways that the government can influence, the marketplace. So why are we giving them another hammer when they're not using the existing hammers necessarily to their fullest?
I totally agree. There's all sorts of programs out there that, you can say that they have political influence, but they're actually narrow, purpose-driven, mission-driven. Let's call them mission-driven funding programs. Problem with a sovereign wealth fund idea, especially if it's one that doesn't have it's not run like an investment fund, like Norway's or Alaska's. If it's run more like a Saudi one or a Gulf one, it can become almost a slush fund.
I just looked up Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's fund is about 970 billion, and the entire economy, GDP wise, is about 2.2 trillion.
Yeah.
So it's well over 40% of the economy, and 60% of the investments go into Saudi Arabia.
Correct.
So there's no investor who is larger than the sovereign wealth fund. And so when you look at the US, we have a larger, pool, but we also have such a large economy. I don't think any of the sovereign wealth funds that exist today could be a model for us because they're so much larger in their impact than we could ever create in the US.
I totally agree. There's never going to be a sovereign wealth fund in the United States that will be able to deliver dividends like a Norwegian fund, like an Alaska fund, dividends to citizens, like an Alaska fund or a Texas fund or the Gulf funds too. I mean, the Gulf funds, funded by energy, are there to, as you pointed out, sustain these economies past a non-oil, into a non-oil future, with the benefit of keeping taxes zero or low for their citizens.
Right.
And I just don't see that there's anything we can do in terms of a sovereign wealth fund to minimize taxes or to provide dividends to U.S. citizens. It's all going to be a political slush fund.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the characteristics that when I look up sovereign wealth fund in the dictionary, it talks about how they have to be consistent. They have to generate returns in a very disciplined way, and they have to be able to invest when the whole market is down in order for them to continue to see, real growth. And I look at those words, consistent and discipline, and I have a hard time with the current administration coming up with, yes, this is their sweet spot. They're going to be able to deliver consistent, disciplined, and unpoliticized investments towards things that are good for all of the American people. I mean, first of all, it would be hard to construct to get the money. Second of all, it would be hard to be as big as it needs to be to influence an economy our size. I would say thirdly, and you may disagree with me, I think there is already a good supply of investments to the various people who need funding. So I would say there's already a pretty large system in place in the US for investments. So therefore, we're kind of creating a solution to a problem that we don't have.
Right.
Then,
yeah.
then we get into the next step, which is, okay, let's just forget about funding and let's forget about size. And let's just whiteboard this and think about how we would run it. Then we get into the political, who appoints the committee? What are the committee's boundaries? Are they bound by things that are real assets, or can they buy crypto? Are they bound by things that are futuristic, or do they need to provide a dividend and a return to people? If they need a dividend and there's no dividend paid to, how do we construct a return profile for the committee to evaluate whether they're good or bad? If the S&P is up 20 and they're up 9, do we fire the board and start again?
We'll be right back.
We hope you're enjoying our episodes. If you are, then we'd greatly appreciate your liking, following, and sharing. Help us help others. Now let's get back to the discussion.
How do you think you should construct it?
Oh, I don't think we should have one to begin with. I just don't think. I don't think we have the consistency and discipline in this country to do that. I mean, if you're going to have a presidentially appointed board, which is what Exim Bank, I mentioned Exim Bank, had, and a lot of government agencies have presidentially appointed boards. They might have, members of both parties on those boards, or used to before Trump 2.2, Trump 2.0. But they're all presidentially elected. And so do you really want presidentially elected people, presidentially appointed people who are, the overseers of the sovereign wealth fund? I don't think so. Right. And yet, and yet are we going to put responsibility for managing these things with like a BlackRock? I mean, BlackRock is the U.S. government's thrift savings plan is essentially run by BlackRock. Do we really want BlackRock or some other folks to private sector folks to to themselves run this thing? No, I don't think so. I think that if you, to the extent that you have, well, I would rather have private sector people run it than politicos. But I think the best solution for a sovereign wealth fund idea is simply to not have it at all. It's not like a pension. It's not like a pension fund where you have to have a government pension fund. That's not an option, right? That's a requirement. But sovereign wealth fund is just a pie in the sky idea that people talk about it because they it sounds nice, right? But it's not. The U.S. is not Norway or Saudi Arabia or beyond Texas. We don't even have the resources that a Texas or an Alaska do, right? As the overall U.S. government. So I just don't see any real possibility that this will happen, especially with an emphasis by many Republicans on deficit reduction.
Yeah, I don't think it fits with I don't think it fits in the current perspective of where we are financially. I don't think it fits with our priorities. I'm not sure it fits with something that's really necessary. Because I don't feel like when I look at these investors, there are investors who are willing to take more risk in the private space. And they want private debt, they want private equity.
Yeah.
I'm
No,
not sure.
yeah, you're right. I mean, you've got folks who are willing to invest in housing, for example, right?
Right. There's real estate funds, there's private real estate, there's public real estate REITs. So I believe that we're trying to solve a problem that we don't necessarily have. And I think that, the overall temperament we need as a country in order to have a sovereign wealth fund is very hard for me to see being achieved. So I think that we need to figure out what we want to be when we grow up. And I think the first thing would probably be let's get control of our debt,
Yeah.
then let's get control of our health, and then maybe let's get control of our educational and future development.
Yeah.
I mean, those things seem like they would be first and foremost. If the health, if we improve the health of America, if we
Right.
improve the way we take care of money and the way the government spends money, yes, we could see a huge improvement in the mental, physical, and financial well-being of a country.
Right. These are, I mean, basically, socioeconomic returns is what you're talking about. And I add on to health and education, I would say uh, infrastructure as well. I mean, when you compare, I was in Japan for a month last year, and Japan's infrastructure is so much better than US infrastructure. It's just unbelievable how much better it is. And even Spain, which I had been to a few years ago, has a fantastic train infrastructure. I just think that there is so much more we can do in terms of infrastructure in this country.
Correct. I think that infrastructure just has, in my mind, kind of a political overtone to it because I keep remembering that senator from West Virginia who kept repaving the road every 2 years. And, the road only got about 5,000 cars a year, but it still kept getting repaved, even though, the pavements last for 20 years, right? And so there is a certain amount of infrastructure corruptness that I feel makes it less broad. The beneficiaries of infrastructure, in my mind, tend to be very narrow and they don't tend to be widespread. And I agree that some of the infrastructure that we've had in internet access has been significant. And I think that's where we need to think about the infrastructure is not just the roads and bridges, but some of the pipes that people operate businesses through, some of the utilities that are trying to develop technologies that are going to be better for us. I think that's the type of stuff that we should be thinking about. So what
So
else?
you would emphasize private sector uh, investments in the infrastructure of the future, so to speak, as opposed to public sector investments in highways and ports and all that.
I just think we need to think differently about it as to what
I think we need. I think I think the private sector is looking for financial returns, and I think there's plenty of infrastructure that the private sector can develop that has financial returns. But I still think that public infrastructure, a lot of it, will not be achieved without some significant amount of government money. Um, for example, from the Highway Trust Fund, which is financed you know, by gasoline taxes, for example.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is stuff in place already for highways. And I guess my question is, if we look at the internet or the um, Wi-Fi and the spectrum, and how does the spectrum get allocated? How does the spectrum get bought for and controlled by the different cellular providers? I think there's ways that we're going to use this spectrum that needs to be thought of in a more holistic manner. So for summing up, sovereign wealth funds, Clem, you'd be a strong maybe, or how do you want to end it on sovereign wealth fund?
I think the chances of us having one, any kind of meaningful one, are zero. I think that, it's quite possible that there could be some empty executive order signed, which means absolutely nothing, because it won't be funded at all. So that's possible. But I think the
You're
chance
saying there's a chance.
well, it's vanishingly small.
All
That
right.
will be one, and that's mainly because you're just not going to have political support from Congress for doing such a thing.
I agree with you. I think that this is just another thing that's being thrown around as an idea to be futuristic and to be different. And I think that the existing government has already built and is funding a lot of these things that we say we want to achieve. So in my mind, this is a solution without a problem. So I would say that it's unlikely to get funded. It's unlikely to be able to be run effectively, and therefore it's probably unlikely that we should go down this path. I'd like to thank everybody for listening and encourage you to listen to our next podcast, which is going to be on inflation and the latest data that came out today. And how is inflation going to rule the markets here in 2025? So thank you for listening, and please like and share as much as you can with our podcast so that we can grow our base. Have a good one.
Thank you.
The views shared on this podcast represent the personal investment views of the hosts. They are for educational purposes and not meant to be taken as investment advice. Listeners should consult their own investment, legal, and tax advisors. Past performance of any investments is not a guarantee for future return.